Hey guys, my name's Action Jackson, and today I'm going to be doing a bit of a different video than I did for the last few. The last couple of videos, I guess, were analyses of PAX gameplay content for Artifact. But there's been a lot of, both intentional card reveals and leaks since then, and I thought maybe what would be most useful, rather than analyzing really deeply the moment-to-moment gameplay, again, which, I'm going to do more of those probably this week. That aside, I thought what might be more useful is to start talking a little bit about deck construction in Artifact, because there's definitely some unique considerations when it comes to this game compared to other card games you might have played like Hearthstone or Magic. And now that there's a lot of cards out there, you can actually get pretty close approximations of decks that are popular in the closed beta. One that has been mentioned a decent amount is like a blue-black control economy ramp deck, whatever you want to call it. And so that's kind of the case study deck that I'm going to use for this video. There's a bunch of different topics that I want to talk about kind of as preamble to that, though. So if you want to just get to like what the deck looks like, I will put a timestamp in the description if I can figure out how, which I haven't tried to do that yet, so we'll find out. Alright, so first up, let's talk a little bit about the concept of archetypal decks, right? Like, across all card games, there's kind of this trinity that exists between combo, control, and aggro, or, mid-range is sometimes considered in that trio. I'm kind of thinking of Hearthstone when I say combo, aggro, and control, but in Magic, maybe mid-range is a better example. Now, these archetypes are useful constructs in card games because they help you think about, staple cards that are very, like, meta-defining and strategic level stuff. And I think when you're talking about the archetypes in Artifact, a little slightly different perspective is useful. I think there's kind of 3 layers of archetypes in Artifact. The first layer that I'm going to call super archetypes are exactly the things I just mentioned. So control is a super archetype, aggro is a super archetype. I would also say that there's like an economy super archetype, and I would define that as any deck where the strategy of the deck involves using its item deck as part of the win condition. Things like tempo, right? Like very classic, when you think of archetypes of decks, this is the category that I would put them in. Now, below the super archetype is the archetype, right? So to me, and you'll see why when I get to layer 3, but there's a middle layer here, which is like, all right, it's not just control, it is blue-red control, or it is blue-black control, or it is blue-black control economy, right? Like these are all archetypes that then lead to sub-archetypes. Now, sub-archetypes is a little unique to Artifact in how important they are, and that's why I think they deserve their own category of thinking. The closest analog to what I'm about to describe would be something like in Magic, where you might say, all right, it's tempo mage, but you have Frostless Lich Jaina, right? So like it defines a more granular part of what the deck is and how it works. So in Artifact, obviously the heroes define a very big portion of your deck. Each hero that you have adds 3 cards to your deck. That's a pretty big portion of your cards. So the hero lineup that you have is what I would use to help define a sub-archetype. So for example, for blue-black control, maybe you have blue-black control with, X number of core heroes, which I'll get to later when we actually use this case study, and then like Lich and Zeus, or Skywrath and Sniper, right? Like there are some slots within the archetype of blue-black control that are flexible, and it's going to change a little bit depending on the metagame. It's going to change on your preference or what cards you have available. It will feed back a little bit into the archetypical list and what staples you run and how many of them you run, because the premier cards affect your mana curve. But generally speaking, the considerations around what cards you put in your deck and what heroes you put in your deck are actually a little disjointed, right? Like primarily your main deck of cards is going to be a package that exists based on the metagame and the archetype. Blue-black control always wants to run Payday. It always wants to run Annihilation. The sub-archetypes might have certain specific considerations to them. For example, what's a good example of something that's been revealed that I can talk about. Okay, so a good example of what I could talk about is certainly a sub-archetype of blue-red control that uses Tidehunter, right? Doesn't necessarily need to use the card that was just leaked, on the day of recording, Fighting Instincts. Maybe it still does, maybe it wants 6 of that effect, but a deck that doesn't run Tidehunter is going to have to run that effect main board if it wants access to it, rather than like hero board, which is what I'm going to use to describe the set 15 spells that you have to put in your deck no matter what, because you're using their associated heroes. Additionally, in the sub-archetype category, you can think about distribution of heroes. So for example, for blue-red control, having 2 blue heroes and 3 red heroes is a fundamentally different sub-archetype than the inverse of that, right? So running... I think I said 2 blue, 3 red, so running 3 red, 2 blue. Anyway, those, you can actually get to the point where you say, like, if I'm 2 blue, 3 red, I'm favored against 3 blue, 2 red, right? Like, that is something I've experientially been through in playing with red-blue control. And both of those sub-archetypes can be valid. Whichever one you decide to go for will depend a little bit on your playstyle and the meta, etc. But there's a lot of room for expression through deck building in Artifact because of how impactful these certain key cards, the hero cards, are, which makes it really exciting for any brewers out there. It's also worth noting that meta shifts will happen at different rates for different layers of archetypes. So subtype shifts will happen all the freaking time because heroes tend to have certain niche situations they're very good at, and if the meta evolves to be faster, for example, maybe you really want Skywrath Mage instead of Zeus because you then have a 6-mana awesome board control spell versus an awesome 7-mana board control spell. Maybe the meta is more creep dependent, and so having access to whatever Skywrath's ability is called is Mystic Flare. Maybe having access to Mystic Flare is more important than having access to Thunder God's Wrath, because there's a bunch of green-blue decks that have big creeps, but their heroes are kind of whatever, so you're more focused on staying alive against big creeps. That's just one example, though. Now, archetype meta shifts, where blue-red control is suddenly better, right? That's still going to happen, but it's mostly going to happen in reaction to subtype shifts. So, for example, in the example that I was just talking about, Skywrath is a 6 and 7 health. That's a big difference. There's at least one card that hasn't been revealed, which I think will illustrate that point. And so, if the meta of subtypes within Blue X control shifts enough where Skywrath is really popular, that will actually cause an opportunity for other decks to now punish the weaker-bodied Skywrath, whereas maybe they would have struggled to easily in one turn kill off a Zeus with 7 health. And at that point, maybe you start to see black-red become more popular, because it can more easily kill off that Skywrath. And so at that point, you're seeing archetype meta shifts. Now, the super archetype meta shifts, the shifts that happen in the metagame of what super archetypes are popular, i.e. control, aggro, tempo, those are going to happen much less frequently. And I would say they're probably only going to be instigated by bannings of cards, if Artifact does that, and who knows if they will, or new expansions releasing. Because the popularity of super archetypes is going to depend on what cards have been printed that are staples that enable those super archetypes to do well. So, for example, out of the cards revealed so far, Annihilation is probably the most meta-warping card in the entire game. I would not describe it as overpowered. I think that it is a very fair effect in the way that it works, maybe unless you combo it in certain interesting ways. It's very, it's only 3 cards in your deck, so it's not overwhelming in terms of the frequency with which you have to deal with it. You can play around it, you can force it out early and then come back in later. It's a balanced card. But the fact that Annihilation exists totally warps the meta around it. Playing an aggressive deck, if you don't have a dominant amount of control by turn 4 when you have 6 mana, Annihilation might just reset all of the hard work that you've done, and you've probably played a lot more cards earlier because your curve's lower, and so you have a massive card disadvantage. Like, that card is a huge deal, and so the super archetype of Control is fantastic in set 1 of Artifact because that card exists. There might be something in the future that's printed which, you know, let's come up with a totally, this card does not exist, I promise, totally random example of something that would, like, hose Annihilation. Maybe a card, I don't think they'd ever print this in Artifact, but maybe a card says, when the Sentries play, disable all 6 mana cards and above in your enemy's hand, right? Like, that's a ridiculous card, but if that existed, now the meta might be warped around that and trying to figure out, you know, Slay becomes much better, and so, like, more aggressive black-red lists are good or something. So anyway, now that we've talked a lot about the definitions I'm going to be using, let's start to actually talk about how you build your deck. Okay, so first, let's maybe compare and contrast a little bit of Artifact's deck building and the concepts that are useful in it against some other popular card games. So in Magic, there's primarily 2 axes along which you deck build, right? One is your land and how it's distributed, and the other is the curve of your spells and creatures, right? In Artifact, there's a very clear analog here, right? Hero distribution of colors, so 1 and 4, 2 and 3, 2, 2 and 1. This is effectively the same as your mana distribution, although there's some really interesting nuances. Like, if I told you for the first 3 turns of a game of Magic you could guarantee you draw a specific color of land each turn, that would drastically affect the way that you build a deck, right? And that's essentially what you can do in Artifact, because you can say on turn 1, I am going to have access to these colors of mana, unless my opponent has initiative and my hero gets dueled, right? So there's a lot of opportunity for very smart deck building around what heroes you have access to on what turns, and therefore how dense you want your curve of playable spells in that color to be on those given turns. If you're thinking about your mana curve, I touched on it a little then, but definitely the way that you think about your mana curve needs to be different in Artifact. You're not just considering, okay, I want to be able to, without fail, play a card on every turn so I don't waste any of my mana, right? Because you literally cannot, unless you somehow guarantee you draw an additional card every turn, starting from turn 1. You cannot, in any game of Artifact, guarantee that you can play a card in every single lane, right? Because you just draw 2 and there's 3 lanes. It's not possible unless those cards generate cards or you draw additional cards. So there's some play there where your mana curve is important. Especially it's important in how it pertains to the distribution of colors that you have and the order in which they come into play. But it's actually much less important than you might think. In certain scenarios, and I'm kind of going to move on to talk about hero deployment now, which is a very important part of your deck building. In certain decks, even though you might have access to, let's say, a 3-mana blue spell, you don't necessarily want to put a blue hero in your first 3. Normally you do, right? Normally you want to have like maybe 1 blue hero and 2 red heroes in the case of red-blue control. But that's not a guaranteed thing, because sometimes, especially if the meta's a certain way, it's more important that you have your bulky red heroes in your first 3 to just survive until turn 2, guarantee your blue hero isn't going to die early, and then you play your 3-mana spell on turn 2. In a lot of cases, that's pretty reasonable. Now, talking about hero distribution, I think this is... I think in general, when you're building a deck in Artifact, you should begin by taking what are the staple cards of your archetype and your super archetype and putting those into a list. So actually I'm just going to use a visual aid here. Let's start with this blue-black list we've been talking about. So blue-black control, right? There's certain cards you pretty much just have to have in the deck, right? They're the win condition cards. And one for me is a great example. We want 3 of those. We want 3 Annihilations. That card's sick. Oh, Payday, of course, right? So outside of these cards, there aren't many that are like guaranteed includes. I guess there's some improvements that are guaranteed includes, right? We definitely want Iron Fog Goldmine. And based off, like, some of the slots I'm filling in here, by the way, are not the cards that are in my blue-black control list, because I have access to cards that we can't talk about. But what I'm building here is perfectly serviceable, and I guarantee you that you could win games with this deck. So let's put in 3 Conflex. this might be a 2 of in my real list, but we'll run it. So, okay, we've constructed the core. We've got 15 cards here, right, that are the core for blue-black control. When we're thinking about our heroes, we know that we're going to fill up 15 more card slots, right, because we have 5 heroes with 3 cards each. So at the end of this, we're only going to have 10 slots that are really up for debate. Like everything else here, with the exception of Conflag, that I would replace with something else in the real game. Everything else here is a must. So now that we have this core, right, we have this fundamental blue-black control list, let's start thinking about the heroes that we want to add. So there's some heroes that are also guaranteed to be critical on the list. One of them has been revealed, but the premier card hasn't. I'm just going to put it in, and you can trust me it's important. So that's Bounty Hunter. Let's think about the other things that are pretty important in blue-black control. Well, to be honest, there's a lot of different ways you can build out the rest of the hero list. Let's think about what those could be. So a list that I quite like is this one, right? But again, like maybe this Zeus, this could easily be a Skywrath, and an argument could be made. Artifact Fire doesn't automatically put in the hero spells, but let's do that and make my point a little easier. Oh, Bounty Hunter, right? Because it hasn't been put here. So this is +3, right? We're actually at 35. So an argument could be made that putting Skywrath in here and having Mystic Flare makes our curve like a little. Well, it's not even an argument. It definitely makes our curve a little lower, right? So in certain metagames, as I said, that could be important. Alternatively, if we were to take out Skywrath, put in 3 Thunder Gods and a Zeus, now you'll see our curve here. Like, this is a more even curve. I'd say that normally this is better. You have neutral cards, not neutral, but like colored cards that aren't hero-specific, sitting in your 6-mana slot. You have Annihilation. So this evens out our curve. This means we can do more things later. We have access to powerful things at every point, likely to draw them. But it just means that at 6 mana, we're less likely to have a 6-mana spell. And that could be a big deal. Also, another alternative option here that might make sense is to take Luna out and put in Skywrath. Luna is much better in a longer game, but maybe marginally worse in a game where you kind of need to have a guaranteed response on turn 6, and the meta isn't heavy on armor. So now let's start thinking about what additional spells we're going to use to fill out this list. So we have 5 slots left. What things do we want that kind of fill out our curve, do something useful, right? Cunning Plan, maybe that could be interesting. I don't like Cunning Plan a lot, though, because we've only got 2 blue heroes. And so we're already heavy on blue. And that's fine, by the way. Like, it's fine to be heavier on the color that you have fewer heroes in, especially if it's blue, because normally that hero is going to go down and it's going to do something big. But we don't want to go too hard on it, right? So let's consider what other options we have. Well, having something that gets us initiative a little earlier than Chain Frost. I mean, especially if there was a list where maybe we ran Sniper instead of Lich, right? Hipfire is a pretty important card in that scenario. There's been no revealed blue spell that gains initiative, so this is the only one we have access to. I'd say probably 3 of those is correct. And now we got 2 more slots to work with. Slay is a very niche card, but let's think about what we don't want, and maybe we can narrow it down. So we definitely don't want Gank, right? The only one it's not a bad card, but anything that kills our own heroes in this list when we're already kind of playing with fire, like we're relying on coming back in the late game with our items. That's the purpose of this deck. So playing Gank, like maybe it's okay with your Bounty Hunter and your PA, but it's also going to damage them, and then that could end up where you have like weaker in 2 lanes rather than just like much stronger in one and much weaker in another. And you'd rather be in that situation, the latter one, because then you can just, deploy 1 blue hero in the lane that's going to lose you an Ancient and wipe the board with Annihilation. It's not a terrible option, but it's not the one I want to go for. For a lot of metagames, Slay is going to be good, and the mana cost that is lower at 3 mana could be relevant too. I'm just going to go with it. For reference, so this is a full list, even though it doesn't look like it, because Bounty Hunter's premier spell has not been revealed. for reference, if this was the real list that I actually play, the cards that are different are Hipfire, Conflagration, and Slay. Right? That's the package that I would swap out for better stuff. Now let's look at items. So this deck, the win condition, right? I defined it as a super archetype of economy in addition to control. So part of the win condition is the items. Now, definitely at least 2 Horn of the Alpha, maybe 3. I think 1 Apotheosis Blade is pretty good because we're going to combo it with Vesture of the Tyrant. We want 3 of those, because this card, oh boy, this is the card that makes the deck. Now, I would normally put 3 of an item that isn't revealed yet as the final 3, but seeing as we don't have access to it, I'm going to suggest that we go for kind of low, let's see, 1 Orb is pretty good, just in case we're dealing with a meta where that's important, and I would say right now all of my decks have 2. So, just so you know, like, all of my decks barring blue-black control. Because in this deck, you're not using your item deck as a sideboard. In most lists, I would say that you are. But in this deck, this is your win condition. So putting a sideboard card in here is not good in blue-black. But because we don't have access to what I want to use, I'm just going to put it in. And then I'd probably put like 2 Traveler's Cloaks in here, just to give your blue heroes a little bit of health. Short Swords would also work in place of the Traveler's Cloaks, but this is fine. Okay, so we have a final list. Now, the next thing that you have to think about is the order in which you're going to play your heroes. So, in this list, let's think about what order we want things in. We want probably Bounty Hunter and Phantom Assassin on lane, like, in round 1 no matter what. The reason why is those 2 heroes can actually kill heroes. And if you can actually kill a hero on turn 1 and you have Payday, right, you can start making your way towards your bigger items a lot faster. And this deck functions getting its items on turn 4 when you annihilate a board and then Payday, right? Like, that's kind of the average result that you get. But if you're able to get a Vesture of the Tyrant a turn earlier, and then maybe you still annihilation that board, you get your hero back, that's a huge tempo advantage. So there's definitely reasons to put these 2 heroes in your first 3. For your final one, well, we don't have any blue cards on 3 mana, right? So we could put Lich there, and it wouldn't actually do anything to our ability to play on curve. That seems pretty reasonable. An alternative option might be to play Luna, though, because that way you start building your Eclipse charges immediately. And I think actually normally that's what you'd want to do. One of the cards that isn't here is a 3-mana blue spell, so that's part of the reason why too. But just keep in mind, like, just because you're playing this 2-color deck does not mean that you necessarily want access to all of your colors of mana on turn 1. You can guarantee you have them on turn 2, and even then it doesn't matter, because only and 1 from me is going to be available. Zeus on the last deploy slot is kind of the only other thing than Bounty Hunter and PA on slot 1 that's guaranteed with this deck. Because by playing him on the final turn, you can maybe sack him in order to get 7-mana blue spell off for sure, or just play Conflag as soon as possible. So as you can see, there's a lot of considerations that you need to make when it comes to how you deploy your heroes, how that interacts with the mana curve that you have, how it interacts with the distribution of colors that you have. You know, I think, yeah, so we're slightly ahead on black in this list. I'd say the real list is closer to 50-50. And so, arguably, I think maybe with some more refinement, this deck might run 3 blue and 2 black. But I'm not totally sure. I've had a lot of success with something that looks a lot like this. It's also worth noting with the limited tech slots that you have, so in this case, the Slay, Hipfire, Conflag slots, that the roles of your hero cards and what you need to supplement them will change depending on the list. Like this list, how does it stabilize on turn 6? Well, it annihilates or it eclipses. So Eclipse is actually a stabilization tool in this list. Like, there's a real possibility that you play this on turn 4. If we had Skywrath Mage instead of Zeus, Eclipse becomes a lot less appealing to cast, because Skywrath's ability actually gets a lot worse over time as things like armor get picked up and health pools increase, but Luna's ability just gets better, right? So maybe that's something you need to consider when you're building out the tech slots. Tech slots in a deck like this, one thing I kind of forgot about too is like maybe there's some creeps we could run. So instead of 1 Slay, we could run 1 Satyr Magician. That's not totally unreasonable. The effect to replenish your mana is really strong, and there's definitely certain moments where, like, let's imagine the best case scenario, right? You vest your Annihilation, put a blue hero back in the lane, play Satyr Magician, big Thunder God's Wrath, right? Following turn, you Eclipse, Satyr, Thunder Gods. Like, these situations exist. So I kind of like this better than actually having 2 Slays. I think 1 is fine. This is mostly in here so that you can respond to an Emissary of the Quorum late game, or, you know, there's some things that maybe you need to deal with earlier. A good example would be like, let's say I'm losing a lane pretty badly. I've got a blue hero that I played on turn 1 that's very low. I deploy a black hero in there too because I'm just trying to stabilize, because this deck does work later. I don't need to be winning lanes right now. And there's a creep, whether it be a melee creep or otherwise, that's about to kill Luna, right? This is on turn 3, 5 mana. If I have a Slay and kill that thing, it means that I have access to Annihilation in that lane next turn when maybe I wouldn't otherwise. So cards like this and Hipfire, which would accomplish a similar thing, are good to have in a certain amount, right? They help you get to where you need to be. So let's talk about aggro. Fuck it, let's just do 2 deck lists in this video. I know everyone wants my videos to be longer somehow, so mine as well. Aggro is a really interesting archetype that I think kind of deserves its own video, but something to get you guys thinking, at least for now before I dive into it too much, is why is aggro hard in Artifact? Like, think back to the blue-black deck at PAX. Why did that deck struggle so much? I would posit that the reason why aggro is hard in Artifact is because with most decks, right, so mid-range, ramp, control, even tempo, you don't care about the creep spawns every turn, right? Like, they're basically just there to add depth and complexity and gold, right? But they don't win or lose games most of the time. Maybe late game, once in every 10 or 15 games, a creep's gonna fucking block you, and you're gonna miss your lethal because you don't have the card, and he's gonna win the next turn, and you're gonna be like, oh man, you know, I made a calculated risk and it didn't pay off. But that's super low frequency. If you think about aggro, right, there was a card that was revealed, let's see, is it on here? I'll put it up if it's not, but might as well use what I got if it's here. Relentless Pursuit. Okay, Relentless Pursuit. This card is extremely important in any aggressive list. The reason why is because variance screws you over most when you're trying to play in all 3 lanes, right? Because any of those lanes could be messed up, and then you don't have enough of an overwhelming force in either of the other lanes to really tear away with the game. So what's interesting is, I know in my first analysis video I preached about not abandoning a lane too early. There is not too early in aggressive decks vocabulary. It is often right to leave a lane on turn 1 if you draw Relentless Pursuit. I'd say, so I've won games on turn 2 with my red-black list that I came 5th in a tournament with. So I think it's pretty good. I know Suns Fan ran something similar, and Swim is the guy who I got the idea from. Relentless Pursuit is key, and you can win on turn 2 if you get out of a lane on turn 1 with this card. Like, it is a big game. But the thing is, what else does that? Right? Like, I don't see anything, do you? Right? There's no cards here that let you leave your lane on turn 1, which you want to do, other than Relentless Pursuit. So that's the first thing. Like, key parts of what makes that deck really busted, like the busted draws it have, are super infrequent, and that already is taking percentage points off of aggressive lists. In addition to that, let's say even that you do get the nut draw, and you Relentless Pursuit away, and then you fucking duel, because you're red-black, you know, you duel your Legion Commander into their thing, and you're pushing like 20 damage on turn 1. Okay, that's possible. That is absolutely possible. But then next turn, 2 melee creeps spawn in front of your things. And then they put a hero there. And then they use a spell that really messes you up that I can't talk about. Right? Like, the variance in aggro in Artifact is really, really high. You can make decks, but the way that you have to win is like, I'd say aggro is like one of the hardest archetypes to play. Because you're not just like, oh man, I want my blue hero to die on turn 2 so I can play Annihilation on turn 4. Nice. You know, like, it's really hard to win with an aggressive list. Let's try and build one now. So first, let's do what we did before. We're going to start with the spells that are kind of a necessity for the list. Let's see. You don't really want gank. You need your heroes to be pretty healthy. Grazing shots can be a stand-in for some other stuff that I would normally put in here. Hipfire is a must. Pickoff's pretty good. Relentless Pursuit. I think this deck is probably missing a little more than the blue-black control, but I'll see what I can do. Creeps, you definitely want 3 Disciples, in my opinion. Maybe 2 and 1 Oath. That's the alternative. Your mileage may vary with this stuff. You're also... So actually, I'm going to take these out. I forgot they revealed some stuff. 3 Trebuchets. This is one of those cards, like, your ideal opening hand with this deck is like Trebuchet, Relentless Pursuit, Untested Grunt could be good, Bronze Legionnaire could be good in your opening hand. This deck is more prescriptive than actually many other decks. Like, there's a lot of cards you just kind of need. I run 2 Unsupervised Artillery in my aggro deck. This card's pretty crazy. Because you are deploying lots of creeps and moving allies into like 2 lanes instead of even trying to focus on a 3rd, you have pretty high uptime on this effect, so that's pretty good. I like 1 or 2 bitter enemies. This doubles up as a way of maybe winning a lane that you would lose, where you've abandoned it, but you're still saying, hey, like, 6 damage to deal 40 is not that crazy if their deck is really slow, so sometimes you might play it that way. More realistically, you're going to play it in a lane that you're winning second most, and that's how you finish that lane. But that's a good card. Okay, and then I think we got to get to heroes, because 15 cards plus here is exactly what we want. I would say Legion Commander for sure. I like Winter Wyvern a lot in this list. It's really, really strong. I play this in my final because of the cooldown. I think I didn't mention that earlier, so I'll get to that in a second. Sorlicon in the first 3 for sure. Phantom Assassin in the first 3 for sure. And then your second red card. This is, I mean, there's so many options. You know, you could take Bristleback, try and use it to snowball lanes some more. You could take Axe so that on turn 6, if you have initiative, you can actually, you know, play the game past that point. It's pretty good. Centaur Warrunner, if you're in a red meta and you just want additional ways of punching through, is good. So this is very much up to you. Do what you'd like. I'm going to take Axe. Oh, we're 2 over. What did we add too much of? Let's see. I think we can probably afford to take out some of these pickups. I don't think they're super important. In fact, take out all the pickups. Do something like this. And I prefer this, personally. Okay, so this is a pretty reasonable aggressive list. This is not exactly what I run, but it's really, really close, and this can win on turn 2. It's kind of gnarly. So with this deck, there's at least one important item that hasn't been revealed. I like the Stone Hall items in general on aggressive lists and tempo lists, because you can be reasonably sure you're going to get multiple ticks, and then late game, when you're going up against Luna and Eclipse, like having Stone Hall Cloak is pretty important. Something like this. The 2 Obliterating Orbs can actually be replaced in this deck uniquely. Aggressive decks don't necessarily need to run that card, but what I want is in here, again. So this is super close. This is 100% a list that will win you some games. It's really hard to play, though. Let's talk about hero deployment order, because I had a point I wanted to make about it. So in this deck, it's actually pretty interesting, because even though you have Axe, who ordinarily you'd never want to play, or sorry, Axe and LC, ordinarily you'd want both of those to be in your first 3. If you look at the distribution of cards, like, this is a way more black deck than it is red. Way more. You absolutely, in this instance, need to have at least 2 black heroes in your first 3. So the first 3 that I would run with this deck is PA, Sorlicon, and Axe. I'd bring LC in round 2 and Wyvern in round 3. The reason why you'd bring Wyvern in round 3 is because this can be a 10 damage burn spell, right? That just wins you the game. Because the active ability of Arctic Burn is a 2-turn cooldown. Cooldowns go off cooldown as soon as the beginning of the game starts. So by the time you get to turn 3, this is available, right? I missed that when I was talking about Skywrath earlier. There's maybe a reason why you'd want to deploy him either on your second deploy or your third deploy, depending on whether you want the armor reduction, which would be good in a scenario where maybe you're against like control, or whether you want to just have him die on turn 2 because he's got 6 health, so that you can play an Annihilation on turn 4. Alright, I'm losing my voice a little bit, so let's summarize. In summary, I've constructed 2 decks in the video of 2 different super types. I've talked a little bit about the different subtypes of those types, and we've gone over stuff to do with your mana curve, your deployment order, your color distribution, your item deck, and whether it's kind of acting like a sideboard or supplementary board, or whether it's acting as a win condition. I'm excited to see what you guys build. Maybe send me some of your deck lists in the YouTube comments if you've come up with anything interesting. I am still finding new decks. Don't get me wrong. I think these decks are great. They've done me very well in a couple of tournaments. This one even taking me, roughly this one even taking me to 5th place in the tournament. But I'm still discovering new stuff every day. Like today, I made a deck with the recently revealed Keenfolk Golem, which I thought was garbage up until this point. And it might still be. I haven't tested it a lot, but it was fun. So I think the meta still has a lot of solving to do, but when you're trying to come up with your decks, you're trying to solve this meta, keep in mind some of the things that I've talked about here, because there's a lot of nuance that comes into building a really good deck in Artifact. Thanks for watching, guys. Catch you next time.